I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Contemplative Science Center to today's dialogue with Sharon Salzberg, who's very kindly joined us here in Charlottesville for today and tomorrow, and also Professor Eric Braun from the Department of Religious Studies here. And so this is not like we're going to talk for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the conversation or the dialogue to people in the audience. And we really only have one preordained trajectory in this dialogue, which is there's a temporality to it. So we're going to start in the distant past, and we're going to end up in the maybe distant future. So it's kind of a sci-fi element and a personal biographical element. So we're really going to just indulge ourselves. Eric and I are both very obsessed with Buddhism and contemplation in the modern world, and so we're going to indulge ourselves in talking with Sharon about those shared preoccupations. And so maybe I'll start by just asking a classic question that I know that you've answered many times before, but just to ground us in the kind of reality of your life. What was the first time that you ever practiced meditation? Not had an experience you might label as meditative, but you actually practiced it. And what was the context?
Okay, hi. It's great to see all of you. I went to India as a junior in college. I was 18 because I'm also a product of the New York City public school system, where they like to, in those days at any rate, they like to have people skip grades. So I skipped the 3rd grade and the 8th grade, and my penmanship is horrible as a result. But anyway, I had gone to India as part of an independent study program to learn how to meditate. And this was in 1970, and I began meditation, to answer your exact question, January 7th, 1971, in Bodh Gaya, India. It was an intensive 10-day retreat. I walked into that compound, never having meditated for one single second before, and the teacher was S.N. Goenka. So there was a certain almost formula to the trajectory of the days, and that's how I started.
And so when you first did that, like the very first day, what was your kind of initial reaction? Like, what the hell is this? Or this is bliss, or this is pain?
It wasn't bliss, but I had multi-layered reactions. The first instruction I ever got, and I actually thought we might sneak in a short meditation period here together. The first instruction I ever got was sit and feel your breath. Just sit and feel the natural in-breath and out-breath as they occur. And as I often say, my first reaction was a little bit contemptuous, like, what do you mean feel my breath? I came all the way to India. You know, where's the magical, esoteric, fantastic technique that's going to change my whole life? And I'd been going to school in Buffalo, New York. I thought, I could have stayed in Buffalo to feel my breath, you know? And then I thought, how hard can this be? And it was like, whoa, this is not so easy. You know, instead of, I thought, okay, what'll it be like 800 breaths, 900 breaths before my mind starts to wander? It was like 1 breath, you know, or 2 breaths. And I was gone, and I was way gone. So it was definitely not bliss. But in the actual experience of it, there was something that spoke very deeply to me, which has never, ever changed from that moment in time, which was there's truth here. There's something here for you that is very profoundly true. And so even though there was so many struggles, not only to concentrate, but others as well, you know, that I felt there was a kind of coming home quality that's just never changed.
Sharon, maybe I can follow up on that and ask, was your sense of the truth that it was something you tapped into that was universal, or was it a sense of truth about your own personal experience? I know you've talked before about like what preceded that, your childhood and everything, and then you head to India. So, or was it both, perhaps?
I think it was largely my own personal experience, in that I've also observed that my motivation for undertaking something like meditation really changed over the years, and is probably still changing all these years later. So in the beginning, I was in tremendous confusion and personal pain, and the resolution, or some degree of resolution of that, was really my goal. And I could have heard incantations about practicing for all beings, or, we practice to develop compassion for the suffering of others. And I would think, yeah, right, it's okay, but what about me? Because, severe pain is like a magnet, and it just sucks in all the energy. And I just had to work with that, because that was the truth of my experience. But as I, kind of grew and things changed and opened, and I felt very different, then it was a very different kind of sense of why I would practice, and what that truth, that sense. I would say another way I'd just define that sense of truth was connecting to something bigger than my immediate circumstance. Then it was a while, but it came to be that I could see the relevance of that in life in general, not just for me.
Another kind of question is, I wonder, over the years now, it's been a number of decades that you've been working with various kinds of, different kinds of practices, both yourself and teaching to others and seeing how they assimilate them. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about the relationship of meditation to aesthetics, to the kind of experience that we have when we encounter a piece of visual art or a compelling poem or a compelling piece of music?
It's interesting. Sometimes, on occasion, I've taught with this friend, Mark Epstein, who quotes James Joyce, and it's sort of a quote, in that I believe he said some version of this, but it's very hard to source if you're trying to use it for publication where you need precision. But anyway, Mark Epstein says James Joyce said that when you're looking at a piece of art, if you hold it too close, it's like pornography. And if you stand too far away, it's like criticism. And he said, what you need to do is just stand right in the middle and behold the piece of art. And I've always thought that was a beautiful description of the quality of mindfulness. That when we are too enmeshed in something, it's like trying to own it, and there's something, there are all kinds of other layers and undertones that come into place. This is going to fulfill me. I need this. I can't let this change. And when we stand too far back, it is like criticism. We're disconnected, or we're kind of cold. And to stand right in that place in the middle and behold it is really the training in mindfulness. And so, and I think we just open up. There's also in the Buddhist teaching where there's a description of certain personality types, and many kinds in many different schools, but there's one type in kind of the Burmese descriptions of these personality types, which I am very fully, and that's the deluded type. And I'm just sort of, yeah, nice. But someone would have to point out to me, hey, look at that clock. Oh, right, that's a nice, good clock, I'm just sort of in my own zone, wandering around in delusion. And I am very much like that, or by nature. And it's only been through training and awareness that the world's kind of opened up for me. And I've noticed things. And I always notice, I co-founded this retreat center in Massachusetts, the Insight Meditation Society, and if we're ever doing a building project and we want to just get some feedback from people about what we should fix or what we should amend, we always ask the people who've been there on a silent retreat, because they've noticed everything. Everything, like every squeak of the floorboard, every sound, every little crack, and it's interesting to think of the contrast of that from how we usually walk around.
Maybe I can follow up with that. That's really an interesting image to me, because I feel like there's been a tension between a sense that mindfulness is about the present moment versus some who have begun to argue that there needs to be some sense of memory, which is, of course, a meaning of the word sati of mindfulness as well. And it sounds like you're kind of placing it in a middle ground where there might be some sense of what's going on in your experience at the same time that you're aware of what's going on now. And I'm wondering if that way you characterize mindfulness if you see that basically in line with what everybody else is teaching, or if you're trying to shift the conversation somewhat.
Well, I feel a few things. One is that I think a lot of the descriptions or definitions of mindfulness, and of course there are many, are quite accurate but are easy to misconstrue. Like to see mindfulness defined as being aware of the experience in the present moment without judging. Or sometimes you hear mindfulness means accepting things the way that they are, the ways that they are, and so I think those are true, but we take them in other ways. Like that can imply an awful lot of passivity. So for example, I was teaching once somewhere, and often when we do a sitting, like the one we're going to do somewhere in here, in this time together, even before we get to the awareness of the breath, we start by listening to sound. And it's just a way of kind of generally relaxing and opening our awareness. So I'd gotten just that far, let's sit and listen to sound. And somebody raised their hand and said, well, what if it's the sound of the smoke alarm going off? Should I sit here mindfully knowing the smoke alarm is going off, or should I get up? And I said, I'd get up. But it sounds that way. You're going to be with your experience without judging. Like, oh, it's a smoke alarm. I'm accepting that, But really, mindfulness is a much more dynamic, intelligent, wakeful relationship to what's happening. One of my big issues about mindfulness, and it's not really an issue, I just think it's not wrong, I think it's incomplete, is that I find that, at least as far as I know, mindfulness is often presented in our time as a way to really inhabit our lives, which is important. We can live to the end of our lives and never actually feel we've lived. We're not really tasting things, we're not really smelling things, we're not really feeling what we're feeling, and so I think it's a huge benefit to actually inhabit your life. And yet, my understanding of the classical purpose of mindfulness practice is not just to inhabit your life and enjoy your tea more and, really enjoy that cup of coffee a lot more because you're not multitasking. As good as those things are, the purpose is really to understand your life. It's to understand what brings suffering because you see it directly. There's so many things that we're taught will make us happier and, will lift us up. But when you really look at them, it's like, whoa. Like, I think that in our time, for example, we're taught often that the more we can demean others, the better we'll feel about ourselves. And so it's really a culture of, putting others down and so on. And you actually, if you look at that in your own mind and the residue, what happens? It's not that pleasant. Or some of the things we've been taught are really weakening, like love, loving kindness, compassion. That'll leave you kind of stupid, and just giving in all the time. Is that true? Let's look at that, and so we have the chance through that awareness of looking at all these different things and knowing for ourselves. And so it's a whole other kind of level of understanding.
So I wonder, just to keep pursuing the question of aesthetics, if you think about aesthetics as like the opposite of something like anesthesia, which deadens our senses, and aesthetics is what enlivens our senses, and that you pointed out the kind of commonality with mindfulness of being attentive to the sensory detail and kind of enlivening your experience of a world that's changing rather than just reading it in a kind of static way. And also, art is something where I think we're very deeply familiar with the notion of practice in this culture. We talk about practicing skills, about practicing drawing and so forth. And so I wonder, if you think about that kind of experience we have with the arts and the kind of experience we have in meditative practice, could someone use the arts in the same way with the meditative practice in terms of those kind of transformative possibilities, not just of inhabiting our lives, but beginning to come to terms with our suffering, our identity, the nature of our relationships with others? Or do you think there's some intrinsic difference there that...
I don't know that there's an intrinsic difference. I mean, certainly historically, there have been whole schools of contemplative art, and artistry of all different kinds. And I think not only do we have the possibility of coming to that kind of understanding, but I think we have the legacy that art leaves us that reminds us we can connect to something bigger. You know, that, again, that we don't need to be defined by our immediate circumstance, and that there may be universal truths. And we may not have the words for that in beholding something, but that's why art is revolutionary. It's a very radical act, you know, whatever form the artistry is taking. I mean, I've done, you know, more and more panels these days on like mindfulness and social action or things like that, and I always try to include art as an example of kind of getting through boundaries or dissolving some sense of limitation.
And just to follow up on that, in terms of like these Buddhist practices of cultivating deep states of concentration,
Yeah.
sometimes when you read the historical text, it feels like they're saying, oh, it doesn't really matter what you use. You know, you could use a colored disc that's yellow and represents earth, or you could use your breath, or you could use a candle, or you could use a statue. Mm-hmm. And yet sometimes when I think about the history of Buddhist meditation and all of its astonishing transformations, that it seems to me you had a bunch of Buddhists saying, it doesn't matter, but somehow it did matter. And what they chose to focus on and concentrate on ended up leading in pathways that went in very different directions. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, the interchangeability or the difference that is entailed when you choose a different thing to meditate upon as a way of cultivating concentration.
Well, my understanding, we can ask the historian, is that, or at least the story that's told is that amongst those distinct objects of concentration, well, first of all, I should say, at least in the school in which I was trained, concentration is just one of the skills that's developed, and so you might be deepening concentration, but it's really a springboard for more open awareness and kind of deep looking at, you know, a big range of your experience. But when you're focusing on the concentration part of it, usually in classical terms, you did choose one object and keep bringing your attention back to it. But often that object was chosen for you by your teacher. And often it was chosen in a way that was meant to balance something else. So if you were very angry or very frightened, they might choose loving kindness for you to help bring your whole system into greater balance and not be so afraid. If you were very greedy, clinging, you know, full of attachment, they might choose a contemplation on death for you, so that you were cultivating that awareness, and that brought a balance so that you could more enjoy the things rather than cling to them of life. And so it was really someone else kind of assessing the situation for you. And in the end, the degree of concentration, at least from the point of view of the school in which I was trained, it's all right. You know, you don't have to have such an extraordinary degree of concentration. You need some before you can open up the awareness. And I'd also say that I, as a person in this society, as a teacher who's really trying to see what people are going through in our time and in this culture, I have a kind of bias toward objects of concentration that are pretty portable for us, because what I would like is to have everybody say you come to a retreat, I'm teaching, or a workshop or something like that. I would like everybody to leave with some more confidence and clarity about how to bring these tools into your life. You know, so as I often say, you know, if you're working and it's crazy and people are getting angry and you're getting more and more anxious, you can't really open up the closet door and pull out your yellow cloth, for example, you know, and like sit down cross-legged and stare at the cloth and close your eyes, you know, to try to fix that image. But you can breathe. And nobody has to know you're doing it. It's completely private. It's totally portable as a resource. And so even if someone's practice is not something like the breath or the body awareness or loving kindness, I'd like to encourage people to at least include some of that so that they have that resource they can touch, whatever circumstance they're in.
Can I ask, in relation to that, how often do you Or do you ever tell people, no, not mindfulness yet, keep with the calming, keep with the concentration? Or is it usually the case that you feel like that calm or stability can come with mindful attention on the breath?
I don't know that I would say, I just got confused by the last part of what you said. Well, I might tell them, maybe not a broader mindfulness quite yet. Stay with the breath for a while, or more likely stay with loving kindness for a while.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes just that kind of open awareness is someone feels that they feel too scattered, or they're not centered enough, or it's a big difference between looking at one's thoughts and being ensnared by them. As one of my teachers said, the thoughts are not the problem, it's the glue. So if you find yourself, just these sort of constantly changing streams of thought and emotion, if you find yourself caught again and again and again and again, it's quite exhausting. And so you might well like a greater sense of centeredness. So even as those same things happen, you have a different relationship to them.
Maybe I could indulge in a slightly technical question, which is that, when you're doing the calm meditation, you can enter into these deep absorptive states called the jhanas in Pali. And I wonder if you ever encourage those for students, or you see those as rather extraneous to what's important.
Well, again, the school in which I was most highly trained in Burmese teaching actually has a pretty clear demarcation between pursuing a path of concentration past a certain point, which you need, as I just described, some certain little amount, but some amount, usually more than we have, of concentration. They make a pretty sharp distinction between that and a path of wisdom or insight. And so from their point of view, and this was a kind of historical moment when my teacher's teacher, Mahasi Sayadaw, decided that unlike as was the custom of the time, which was like the turn of the 20th century, that you needed really an extraordinary degree of concentration before you could go on into a kind of broader awareness. You didn't need that much. And that may not sound very revolutionary, but that was actually quite revolutionary because if you needed an extraordinary amount of concentration before you could move on to these insight or wisdom practices, that meant you needed a pretty unusual life, It's pretty hard to, say, work 2 jobs and get that degree of concentration, or be a graduate student and get that degree of concentration in your practice. And so it really meant that kind of prospect of a liberating practice was held. In those days, the nuns were gone, it was only monks. And so he came along and he said, no, really you need a much lower degree of concentration before you really investigate your life and look at all those changing circumstances. And so that returned the practice to the people. And that said, you don't have to just practice to be a little calmer. You can have a practice that really upends your whole notion of who you are and helps you see much more clearly how things actually are in life. And so it was a sociologically revolutionary act, and that was really my whole orientation. It's very funny, as I sometimes say, where, by the time we met him, Mahasi Sayadaw, he was quite old. He was the patriarch. He was universally acclaimed, And then to hear he'd been like a rebel in his youth, They said it was like realizing your grandmother was a Bolshevik or something like that, I was like, wow, that's really unusual. But apparently it's not unusual.
Well, given that you spent your whole life in this business, let's say,
Yeah.
It's kind of a little ironic to have you say that because it's relevant to the fact that you become a teacher of many different people. But I wonder, in terms of yourself, how you understand that. Mm-hmm. Is that something that was relevant to the choices that you made about the practices that you did and the pathways that you follow? And I also wonder how much of that do you feel was, you ended up there in India, or you ended up in India, Burma, et cetera, with these particular sets of people. and might have Sharon back when she was in her 20s ended up with a different set of people and gone a different pathway. How much of this was you? How much it was them? How much it was the historic moment, do you feel? Or?
Right. I think I think it was a combination of them and the historic moment, because there are also ways, one can pursue what they would call the path of concentration through the jhanas and so on, and that's just a particular training. And often they would suggest that or offer that after you've had some amount of experience in insight meditation, because the underlying truth, whatever you're doing, is that getting attached is going to cause suffering, and that clinging to your experience is never going to work. We can't keep life static and just hold on. And so they really like people to have a kind of more fluid, flexible ability to be with a range of things and understand it's not wrong if your experience hurts. It's painful, but that doesn't mean you're going through the wrong thing and it's got to be all bliss and ecstasy. It's just not, it's not a view like that. In fact, I almost answered you differently, David, earlier when you asked me about how my earliest practice was. And what I almost said was that not right away, like in that first retreat, but pretty soon after. I was 18 years old. I'd had a really traumatic childhood. I'd never really looked at it before. I'd never been in therapy. I'd never done much introspection, but I knew I was very unhappy. And then there I was, doing all this meditation. And I'm still very close to many of the people I started my meditative life with, and I'm somewhat famous amongst them for once having marched up to Goenka, who was the teacher, and looking him in the eye and saying, I never used to be an angry person before I started meditating, thereby laying blame exactly where I felt it belonged, which was on him. I mean, clearly it was all his fault. And he laughed, and I'd also, of course, I'd been hugely angry, but I hadn't been in touch with it. And so that was part of what was difficult and challenging, is getting in touch with all of those things. But things that are hard aren't necessarily at all wrong. And so before you're encouraged to do practice that will more than likely produce these extraordinary states of consciousness, they want you to have that understanding. But I've always enjoyed, the prospect. I love meditation as an art form, and to explore just some of the different things that one's mind is capable of, So I like those practices, and once I was able to do them, with some guidance. But they were always considered not the real point, in a way.
What kind of practices do you have in mind?
Well, jhanic practice or
okay.
concentration practices they call it jhanic play, It's a form of play.
The mention of therapy raises a question I was wondering what you thought of. I know Jack Kornfield has made the argument before that a lot of meditators would do well to be in therapy as a kind of complement, maybe even prior to at some points. And I'm wondering if you see the practice of mindfulness or meditation more generally as something that can directly speak to issues, or is in some sense running parallel to personal development or kind of self-awareness or whatnot that might be explored in therapy?
I think it can be either, and I think that the question of our personal suffering is very real, and the power of having a sense of inner resource is also very important. So we might meet an external situation or a memory or whatever in many different ways, depending on what we're meeting it with. If you're exhausted, if you're generally overcome, if you've, it's going to be much harder. And so I don't think it's at all wrong or lazy or remedial work to think I need other resource building tools, in order to meet. Like we say it very glibly, like mindfulness means being aware of what's happening without holding on or pushing away, without getting deluded or without grasping aversion, delusion, or whatever. And that's not easy, actually. How much shame do we tend to add to something that's painful, for example? Like me in that anger. How much do we call it bad and wrong rather than painful? How much do we judge, kind of mercilessly? those exercises in current psychotherapy where you imagine you're saying to your friend sitting on the next chair the thing you just said to yourself, and it's very alarming, like, ooh, I can't believe I talked to myself that way. It's not that easy to just be with our experience. And so tools like psychotherapy, for those who feel they need that resource, it's tremendous to be able to meet that. I'd also say, we practice, this is a very interesting time. It's a very pioneering time for all of you, for all of us who are, structures and styles are really just at the beginning in this culture. And so, I think about some of my relationships with my teachers, which were very directive, very different, even in the context, say, of a 3-month retreat, the way they were instructing me compared to how they were instructing others. And very often, very close. And like someone asked me once if I thought I had reparented myself with this one teacher, this woman named Deepa Ma. And I said, I reparented myself with all of them. And that's very different, I think, when you're getting it from a book. Or you're sitting with a teacher and there are 8,000 people in the room. So what many people find in that relationship with a therapist, where someone is always on your side, and they're also a kind of dispassionate eye on your experience, so you don't get so caught up in your own stuff, and they're kind, all those things. That's how we were with our teachers. And so what's going to happen now? It's very hard to say. It's very interesting.
It struck me when you were talking about your experience that you're now at the forefront of mindfulness and the movement here. And your experiences in many ways in Asia sound like they were incredibly rich on a personal level, with teachers who were often known for much beyond just mindfulness. Like Deepa Ma is quite known for her supernatural abilities, right, and such things. And so it's been a real shift. And I actually was wondering, this sort of leads me to the question, I don't know that there's an average meditator, but has the concerns you see, the spectrum shifted from, say, the 70s and 80s to now? Right? Do people need different things? Are there different things they're bringing to the meditation, or is it the same old kind of problems that have always been appearing?
First, I feel like I should say something about Deepa Ma. It's considered within that structure that if you pursue concentration, which is a process of, and maybe, I'll answer this question and then we'll do a short sitting, okay? What happens in the path of concentration is you choose an object of awareness, you find your mind's all over the place, your attention's all over the place, you recognize that, and you kind of gather that energy back, that attention back to that object. You keep gathering, gathering, gathering. So in the end, so much more of that energy is available to us. And that's why that path is considered the path of power. Not love necessarily, or wisdom, or graciousness, or compassion, or anything, but power. And power could be used in a lot of different ways. And within that school, there's a whole description of using just that energy for what we would call supernatural things. They just think they're natural. They don't think they're supernatural because they have a bigger vision of what's possible with life. And it's said that my teacher, Deepa Ma, she came into meditation practice in a state of extreme grief where she'd been living with her husband in Burma at the time. He was in the civil service. They were Bengali. And 2 of her children died, and then her husband died very suddenly. He wasn't feeling that well one day, and he died by that night. And she had one daughter, Deepa. Her nickname is Deepa Ma, or Deepa's mother. And she developed this heart condition, and she just went to bed. She couldn't get out of bed. And the doctor came, and he said, "You're actually going to die of a broken heart unless you do something about your mind. You should learn how to meditate." And she got up out of bed, and she went to the meditation center and said that she was so weak. The meditation hall was on what we would call the first floor, or they would call the first floor. up on the top of the stairs, and she couldn't even get up the stairs. She was so weak. So she crawled to get into the meditation hall. And when she came out of that retreat, somehow she had metabolized all of that grief into compassion. And if I was going to say anything about her, is that she was known for her love, her loving kindness, really, and her tremendous compassion toward everybody. And it's also said she had these powers. I never saw them displayed, but I have no reason personally to disbelieve it. But they were almost like irrelevant, like we don't talk about that. We talk about how kind she was or how amazing she was and her warmth and her love. So it's sort of like, yeah, maybe she could do that. They say she could do that. It would be fun to see, I suppose, someday. All those stories, she could bake a potato in her hand and make it taste like chocolate. Things like that. That's the famous Deepama story.
Did you eat one of those potatoes?
Did I? No, I never. See, that's it. I never witnessed it.
Chocolate potatoes.
What was your actual question?
Well, if the spectrum of, I say spectrum just because I know people differ, but if generally the drift of meditators has changed and what they're concerned about and such.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a big mystery, I will say that because the techniques and the methods are so much more available, that's an interesting quandary. Like, in my day, one of my friends teased me and she said, "You're like those people who say, when I had to go to school, I walked through 4 feet of snow barefoot." In my day, it was not that easy, And I went to India when I was 18. I'd never even been to California before. But I felt such a deep, deep desire to learn an actual how-to, and I just couldn't find it. I looked around Buffalo where I was going to school. I just didn't see it. And so I just got an email from somebody, or no, it was a tweet, actually. Somebody just wrote me a tweet and said, "I live in Buffalo. Can you recommend a teacher from your time here?" I was like, well, no. That was the point, that's why I went to India, And it's curious to us. We talk about it often, actually. Like, what does it mean that something could be so much more available? And you don't have to have such a kind of intense amount of suffering to reach out. Or some people do, of course. But sometimes you're just kind of curious, and you want to understand your life better or just the thing better. And what does it mean to have that kind of openness? And we don't know. I mean, I think a lot of what we see is because of the accessibility, that people come from a much wider range of motives now. Let's sit together. I'll guide you through. So I'm going to bring you back to my earliest days with that technique. See if you can just sit comfortably. Have your back, if you can, be straight without being strained or overarched. You want some energy in your body, but also just be at ease. And you can close your eyes or not, whoever feels most natural to you, most comfortable to you. We're only going to sit for about 5 minutes, so even if in that period of time you get really sleepy, you can just open your eyes and continue on. And at first, don't see if you can just sit and listen to sound. Whether it's the sound of my voice or other sounds. It's a way of relaxing deep inside, allowing your experience to come and go. Of course, we like some sounds and we don't like others. But you don't have to chase after it to hold on or push away. Just let it flow through. And bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. Bring your attention to your hands. And see if you can make the shift from the more conceptual level, like, oh, fingers, to the world of direct sensation, picking up pulsing, throbbing, pressure, whatever it might be. You don't have to name these things, but feel them. And bring your attention to the feeling of your breath. In this system, it's just the normal, natural breath. Wherever you feel it most strongly, that's the nostrils or the chest or the abdomen. You could find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. And if you find your attention wanders, you get lost in thought, spun out in a fantasy, or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. We say the most important moment is the next moment after you've been gone. It's the moment of letting go and the moment of beginning again. We let go of whatever's distracted us gently. And with some kindness toward ourselves, return our attention to the feeling of the breath. We let go and we begin again. That's not a problem, that's actually the practice. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you for that.
So I have a retrospective question for you. So there you are in the 1970s in the kind of detritus of the acid dreams of the 60s. And yeah, it's true. And then 5 decades, you have this kind of rich history of the unfolding of mindfulness, yoga, contemplation, and so forth in the United States. And I wonder if you kind of think about that in retrospect, those 50 years and the different things that unfolded. If you could go back and tinker with it and there was one thing you could change, what would that be?
Um, I think of two things, I think. One is that I think there were things, patterns in this society we didn't recognize quickly enough, and I wish we had just started emphasizing certain things earlier. So, for example, I went to India. I made amazing friendships that are lifelong friendships. We got really close. We had a tremendous community. We were meeting challenging physical circumstance and all kinds of things kind of together. And then we came back, and some of us came back and started teaching, and it didn't occur to me how lonely people could be here and how, or any of us really, that how alienated you might feel if you had certain values about your life and you were working somewhere, 5 days a week, which did not share those values, and the kind of fragmentation in this society. And so it was like a really long time before we emphasized community as a really important thing to be looking at and a really helpful thing. And there were probably any number of things that were a little bit delayed because we had it and we didn't really appreciate how rare and unusual it was. And then I went to Burma in 1985, and that's where I first did intensive loving kindness practice, and came back and started teaching it in 1985. And my first book was called Loving Kindness. It came out in 1995, and I wish I'd written it sooner. And that loving kindness had become just earlier than it actually did, something that is now appealing to researchers to look at, and looking at applications of loving kindness kind of all across the board, because it goes back to what I was saying about really mindfulness is not that easy, And I did feel I got a lot of pushback when I started teaching loving kindness. It's like it's a feel-good practice. It's not really a wisdom practice, and you'll never see emptiness that way, and all kinds of things, So it took about 15 years or something. But now I feel extremely gratified, that it's so much more prevalent, and I kind of wish that had happened earlier.
What does IMS, or is it, maybe it's not centered at IMS, but in what ways are you guys specifically looking to build the community now? And perhaps I could tag onto that, because we had discussed this earlier when, if issues that have been at the forefront recently of race and gender and such have come into that conversation about community.
In terms of the latter thing you said, that is very much centered for us at IMS. Because we started the retreat center. We moved in on Valentine's Day, 1976. And so we've watched the waves of people who are becoming more and more interested in the practice. And that practice, it's an intensive retreat center. It's not like taking a class down the block. So it takes something, to be able to get there. And, at some point we realized, we're all of an age. This isn't good. And so we did this big blast of outreach to try to get younger people, and we realized we're all white and Jewish, that's not that good either. And so again, there's a lot of effort around that, which is all to the good, and I would say probably one of my deepest personal values, which was heavily reinforced by doing loving kindness practice, is inclusivity. And we talked about this also earlier. We talked about how I or many of my colleagues might tend to use terminology that really has people feeling left out, because you might not all know the Pali Sanskrit terminology for something, and I don't know it all either. But, when I hear, if I'm sitting and co-teaching and somebody uses a word or a term that makes no sense in possible ordinary conversation, I feel uncomfortable with that. I don't like that sense of creating a situation where others, by definition, are going to feel like they're on the outside, or they're left out. And so there is a tremendous commitment to really opening up that conversation. A lot of the kind of community in the regular sense of the word doesn't happen at the retreat center. It happens where people live. These days, increasingly, interestingly, it happens online. And I see, like I have students who, I teach one 7-day intensive loving kindness retreat at the Insight Meditation Society every year. And, these two people came to me afterwards and said, oh, we're forming a support system for one another. Every day we're going to text the other about something that we felt grateful for that day. One of them lived in Milwaukee and one of them lived in New York City, and they didn't know each other, and they're still doing it. There's another whole group that actually they call each other every morning, and then they sit silently together on the phone. I can't say I personally find that inspiring, but, they love it, it's really helpful. And then, if you use certain apps, there's certain ways of registering. So I always get these announcements like, I'm about to sit for 20 minutes with 4,382 other people, because they keep accounts of who's sitting when. And we really need that sense of community, and we're working on it.
So maybe as we come to the end of our three-way dialogue, we could turn towards the future. And I wonder, when we're thinking about community, the thing that I think about is that it's not just the actions that we take towards each other, but it's also the kind of shared fabric of a world in which we live. And it may be artificial, but it's something that we've collectively invested in. And so our kind of love and care and emotions and memories and aspirations are all encoded in that world. And that's the fabric of space and time and how close we stand to each other and the words we use and so forth. And historically, that's been something that religion has been profoundly important for. And that's why people often think cosmology and contemplation are very distant, but they're not distant at all. They're like completely intertwined with each other. And so I wonder, as you kind of look forward and you think about that shared past we have, whether Buddhist or religious or Native American or Taoist or whatever it might be, Jewish, and the prospects for the future. Where do we find that cosmology that's interwoven with contemplation and community? And when people talk about the spiritual but not religious movement, for example, that strikes some of us at times to be vacuous of community and vacuous of that shared richness of a world that we jointly inhabit. What are your thoughts about the big question, future of religion and spirituality and, cosmology and contemplation and so forth?
This is why I only get to come here every other year. I have to prepare. I have to meditate all 2 years in between visits. What was David going to ask me? I don't know. I'm not ready. Well, I feel I'm in an odd. Here, I'm going to say I don't know either. But my first teacher, as I said, was S.N. Goenka. It was an intensive 10-day retreat. The first night of the retreat, Goenka said the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught a way of life. This is in no way about becoming a Buddhist or rejecting anything else. And that was the first night, so that was very foundational teaching for me and perspective, and I've held it ever since. And I remember when you came and interviewed me in New York, that came up, and people ask me all the time, what do you think about secular mindfulness? And I laugh and I say, well, in my mind, mindfulness has always been secular. Because here it was, the first night, and I think it's vitally important that people not feel they have to believe something or buy into some dogma, that it's one's own experience, and using the tools in a hopefully supportive way is the whole point, so we can discover for ourselves. So I'm really sympathetic to that point of view, but I also agree with you, because I also see now, people are saying, can you marry me? Do you ever officiate at weddings? What about? So-and-so just died. Can you do the memorial service? And I don't know what we would call it. It's not a christening, but it's like a Buddha-ing or something of a baby, which I've also been asked to do. And like the things of life and are demanding rituals where we can come together and have a sense of a shared understanding, and the end of isolation around those kind of markers. And what do I do when somebody is nearing death? What do I do when somebody has died? And what about this kind of practice? Can we do it in a group? And those things keep coming up. And so for me, it's been so long since I was 18, and I went to India. I feel totally comfortable. I feel most comfortable using the imagery and the languaging and the stories of the Buddhist tradition. I mean, that is the tradition I grew up in effect, and really growing up, not before. And so I am enriched by that personally. And I also understand the Buddha did not teach Buddhism, the Buddha taught a way of life. So I try to have some offering of what seems to be kind of essential elements of that without it having to be Buddhist, in that way.
Do you do weddings?
What?
Have you done it? Weddings, Buddhings, what have you? Oh, yeah? Okay.
It's very rarely, but I do.
Do you encourage people to ordain when they want to? Like, do you connect to, when you're
Sure.
sort of looking?
I mean, I can't ordain anyone.
No.
And I think, one of the things about the Theravada tradition of Southeast Asia, say, is that ordination is something that is considered fine to do, even if it's like for summer or something like that. There's not like a sense of powerful disgrace because you left the robes and you went back to lay life. And so it's a tremendous thing, I think, I've never done it, but I think it's a tremendous thing to have that, as part of one's life experience. And it's so weird for us. But maybe, something comparable is, say, coming to the Insight Meditation Society and doing a 3-month retreat, which people often, say, oh, my friends and my family are completely freaked out because I'm here for 3 months. And I just think it's so interesting because, you could say you're going to graduate school for the next 8 years and they wouldn't blink, But you're going to do this, it's so weird. But yeah, I think that's a great thing to do.
So I think with that, we should segue to any kind of questions you might have or comments from the audience.
Oh, and you're getting a microphone. That's so nice.
Yeah.
Hi, hello. With the
Could you hold it up a little?
Oh yes, can you hear me now? Testing. With the Me Too movement really paving the way for just a greater awareness of women's particular obstacles that they face and their experiences. How is your community changing in the wave of Me Too? What are the responses that are happening there? I'm more exposed to the Tibetan Buddhist side of things, and maybe the response is minimal. So I just say that to express sympathy towards whatever answer you might have. And then secondly, how would you say your own journey to this point with this book and coming here over and over again, how would that be different had you not been a woman? Have there been particular gendered experiences in really rising to the ranks of being a female spiritual leader in this time? So, thank you.
Okay, sure, thank you. I don't know that my experience has really largely been marked by the fact, as a student, and becoming a teacher, has largely been marked by the fact that I'm a woman, except that the person who told me to teach was this woman, Deepa Ma, which is interesting. And I described her life a little bit. And when she told me to teach, I'd gone to see her in Calcutta in 1974. I was coming back here to the States for what I thought was going to be a very, very brief visit back before I went to live the rest of my life in India. And when I went to see her, she said, well, when you go back, you'll be teaching. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will. And I said, no, I won't. And she said two things that were really extraordinary for me. She said, you really understand suffering. That's why you should teach. And coming from her, that was an amazing thing. And it also was the first time in my life I had thought about the things I'd gone through as a child as being kind of worth something, And I also know she didn't say, like, your realization is so awesome, that you should teach, or your scholarly mastery is so breathtaking, And that's interesting, because it was like a real life thing, right? You really understand suffering. That's why you should teach. And the second thing she said to me was, you can do anything you want to do. It's your thinking that you can't do it that's going to stop you. And I left her room, which was, we would call it like a tenement. And I walked down those stairs thinking, no, I won't. And as it turned out, yes, she was right. And I was wrong. I didn't feel like I had any less access to extraordinary teachers or the best of their teaching. There was a little bit of, but remember, I never became a nun. I never entered the system in a way that would have really constrained my life. There was a little bit of kind of paternalism, I guess you'd call it. I remember after learning loving kindness when I was in Burma, one of my teachers said to me, you'll be a really good teacher of this for women. And I thought, that's not how it works, actually. But I wasn't caught in it because it didn't really affect my choices and who I was going to decide to teach. And I would say probably the largest pushback I got is what I actually talked about. And it wasn't because I was a woman, but it was because I was teaching loving kindness, which were kind of those values. It was kind of like a girly practice. And it wasn't like, being a warrior or whatever, or so people think. And since teaching loving kindness or compassion, even though I teach quite a bit of mindfulness, I mean, my thing really is loving kindness. And, so it has been since 1985 when I've been teaching it, that I've also seen some movement there. It's not quite that level of, that's all right if you're emotional or something. And I don't know that my community has so much been affected by the Me Too movement so much as before then, when people like nuns who are within the system and suffering from the kind of either lack of support that is pretty endemic in that structure for women compared to men, or some real difficulty in those situations. Like my teacher in Burma, as a student of Mahasi Sayadaw, who I talked about before, taught a tremendous number of lay people and a tremendous number of women. And the nuns who were ordained in that particular center, whether Burmese or any nationality, tended to really practice. And there are plenty of nuns who are like servants within the Buddhist world. They sew for the monks, or whatever. And so even though that wasn't my direct experience, it clearly is a problem. And it kind of really started erupting quite some years ago now, and is, it's still in process, but it's a happening event.
Thank you so much. Your talk is very interesting. And now these days, meditation is become so famous and also kind of a fashion. So my question is, during meditation, we are doing nothing other than mental exercise. And what I see is during meditation, we are operation on our mind. So normally doctor, when they operation on brain and heart, they have to be studied, trained well. So my question is, without enough instruction and knowledge and foundation, if someone do meditation, is there any risk involved? The reason why I'm asking you is one of my friends, he told me that he was kind of happy and okay before meditation. After he started meditation, he's become something, like a little bit problem. So when I asked him, do you have meditation teacher or have enough resources? He told me he just watched few from the YouTube, that's it. So, and then my second question is, do you see Buddhism is a religion or is a pure science and philosophy? Thank you.
It's very difficult these days, because I think even without extensive background and knowledge of meditation and so on, it's very easy to have certain ideas about what should happen. And I see many people punishing themselves in a way. Like if I'm introduced to somebody as a meditation teacher, these days a very common response I hear is, oh, I tried that once, I failed at it. And I say, well, what did you think should be happening? Because we believe you can't fail at it. You might have a very difficult, challenging experience, but that's not failing. Because what's most important is not what's happening, it's how we're relating to what's happening. And so people then say, well, I couldn't stop my thoughts, I couldn't make my mind blank, I couldn't keep anxiety from coming up, and so I got into this struggle. And, we believe the purpose is not to make your thoughts go away or abolish them, but if you go into it thinking that's what has to happen and it doesn't happen, you get very disappointed and then you get very frustrated and you think, I can't do this, I have no qualities, I have no ability, something like that. So I really try to have people even understand that elementary thing. And then the purpose, we would say, or one of the essential elements of mindfulness is balance. It's not what is happening, it's how we're looking at what's happening. And so it's not actually considered skillful to sit endlessly with painful feeling, whether physical or emotional, if we're just getting tired and we're getting resentful and we're getting overcome. It's much better to shift and get a kind of new beginning, but people then think, oh, well, then I'm being lazy or I'm a coward, I don't have enough strength. And, so I think it's just so much harder without a teacher or a community or somebody to ask questions of. And I think the best kind of apps and programs like that have some way you can ask a question and really get some guidance. Because otherwise it's just tricky. I mean, for most people it'll be fine, but for some people, they won't know what to do and they'll feel bad about themselves, which is really not the point. And I think of Buddhism as a psychology. It's a psychological system.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for being here. I think I have a related question. Your stories of your teachers and your learning, it sort of brings a nostalgia for that sort of one-on-one kind of teaching and the value of community and being with like-minded people. And I'm just curious, as there's this huge interest in meditation now, this huge expansion, and it feels as though the field is getting monetized and it costs a lot of money and you can sign up online and be a teacher.
I keep reading that.
Yeah.
No, it's true. I keep reading it's like $1 billion industry, and I think, where? It's like...
But it makes me wonder, how do you see the ability to scale up? If there is interest, and this would be something that most of us, many people would engage in every day, but to have enough of that ability to have guides and teachers around, how do you see that happening?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I have lots of dialogues with people about scaling, because I say, well, how do you know that's the most important thing? It's never been that way. Maybe, 15 people going more deeply is more helpful to this world in the end than 100,000 people doing something in a very shallow fashion. We don't know, right? But it is a value that keeps getting promoted. So my main concern is in the teaching, the quality of the teaching. And I think technology is actually a help to that because you can disseminate more widely someone with some experience. And I don't say that just because I've been meditating 1,000 years, but it's different. Even what I just said, like the point isn't to block your thoughts. Not everybody teaches that way. And I think it puts people at a disadvantage. So I have this conversation with friends of mine doing research a lot because someone has to do the intervention. And many organizations or entities, what they want is someone to come in, and let's say organizations, corporations, they want someone to come in and train their HR department to teach people how to meditate or be mindful. And it's something I've always said, no, I'm not going to do that. You may decide, even out of compassion, sometimes that happens, train the facilitators at a jail or, whatever. And I said, that may be an essential thing to do in just out of kindness, but that's not my thing. And I remember I was talking to somebody who wasn't an organization, it was some other entity. And she said to me, they don't want people perpetually coming in from the outside to deliver the training. They want their own people to be trained. So I said, how long is the training? And she said, 8 hours. And I said, you can't do that. And I said, at the very least, don't have people feel they're done at the end of 8 hours. At least have them form a community, and there's continuing ed, and there's something like that. And she said to me, that's the only way to scale. And this was an organization that deals with a lot of human suffering. So I think it was like a genuine compassion that wanted them to see ways to try to really have these practices be much more available. But I don't know the answer to that. But I do think that for all we, put down technology, I feel better about the widespread dissemination of a voice of someone who's had more training than 8 hours.
Sharon, thank you so much for being with us. I had a follow-up question on that. And you said that your relationship with your teachers was something like reparenting for what you needed in your life at the time. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that relationship specifically was. And some of my questions are like, how many times a week would you see the teacher? And when you saw the teacher, how long would you spend with them? And what kind of, would they ask you questions, or would you just be reporting? And then also, over how many years? I mean, were there any, and if these teachers had those kind of relationships, how many students would they have who were actually in this kind of deep personal guidance? Thank you.
I think it was very different because the form of the encounter was very different. Like some teachers I studied with in the form of intensive retreat. So maybe I'd see them once a year, but I'd sit under their guidance for an intensive month or 3 months, something like that. Other teachers, like this one teacher of mine in India, was just kind of around, And I'd go ask them questions when they came up, or especially if I was sitting with another teacher and I got somewhat confused, then I would go to him, and he just had an ability to sort of dispel that. I didn't see Deepa Ma in a steady state. She lived in Calcutta. I was living in different places in India. I'd see her now and then. Then we brought her to the States once we had a center, several times. But years might go by but I always felt like in touch with her in some way. With this one teacher, Sayadaw U Pandita, who ended up being my loving kindness teacher in 85, we actually brought him to the retreat center in 84 in Massachusetts. And he taught a 3-month retreat, which I sat. And so he was an example of somebody who worked very differently with people, but we didn't know it because it was a silent retreat. So we were seeing him 6 days a week for these very short meetings. They call them interviews for some reason, where you just describe your practice and he would give you some feedback. So he also turned out, we never met him, when we brought him, and he turned out, we heard he was a great teacher, which he was, and he also turned out to be extremely tough and demanding and fierce. And at that point in my life, in my practice, it actually really worked for me. One of his favorite things to say was, try harder. Whatever you described, he'd say, try harder. And I took that to me, that internalized in me as, oh, he thinks I can do it. He thinks I can really, do this well. Whereas other people were just like crushed, and you could hear them crying. It's like terrible. But he was working very differently with people. In that particular retreat, he just happened to be working with me in a way that was really emphasizing mindfulness in daily life activities. So I'd go in to see him, and I couldn't describe, before I could describe, say, my sitting meditation, which is what I was supposed to describe, or my walking meditation, he'd say to me, tell me everything you noticed when you washed your face, which was nothing. So I'd leave, and I'd sit as mindfully as I could, and I'd walk as mindfully as I could. And then when I washed my face, I'd feel my hands in the water, and I'd feel the water on my face. And I'd go in the next day, and before I could say anything, he'd say, tell me everything you noticed when you drank a cup of tea, which was nothing. So I left, and I'd sit, and I'd walk, and I'd wash my face as mindfully as I could in case he went back to that. And then when I drank a cup of tea, I'd kind of like reach for the teacup and feel the warmth of the cup, and I'd smell the tea, and I'd taste the tea, and then I'd go in the next day, and it was like all like that for a long time. And as a consequence of that, I was slowing down quite a lot because I never knew what he was going to ask me about. And I had friends, like Joseph sitting there at retreat, and he's zipping along really fast. And I thought U Pandita was saying the same thing to everybody. And I thought, why am I the only one listening to him? Like, what kind of people pleaser am I? Everyone's going around their own merry way, walking fast. And I'm like creeping along. And it was only at the end of 3 months that I found out, oh, he wasn't working with everybody that way. He was working with me that way. So that's the benefit of like the container of the intensive retreat, seeing a teacher over time, but it's not always like that.
I had a question, thinking about, hi, thanks for being here. Accreditation, and when is a teacher really a true teacher? And, especially with the explosion of interest in mindfulness, and I'm sure not everybody that's putting themselves out there is a real true teacher. So how do we know? Is there any kind of, things that we can look for, or is the mindfulness community trying to answer these kinds of questions? I guess.
I think the mindfulness community in fits and starts is trying to answer these questions because it's very tough. I mean, some people really tried, and it didn't go over very well. I mean, there's no such thing as licensing or anything like that. All you can do is recommend somebody. And we used to ask, and not in a chastising way, but just out of interest, who was your teacher? Because that was usually indicative of something. Like maybe you knew that name, like, Thich Nhat Hanh, you knew he was like passionately involved in social action. So if somebody said Thich Nhat Hanh was their teacher, that was kind of a clue that perhaps they too were interested in that. Or somebody mentioned some other teacher who was very famous for kind of that kind of intense concentration practice, and that would be a clue, of their background. And so it's a less relevant question now because people are just sort of arising or whatever, but that's an interesting way to, get to know somebody. And then a lot of it is your intuition, and it's your knowledge and your sense of the integrity of the teacher, because that's what you're really counting on. And don't be afraid to feel like a consumer, which is a funny way of putting it, but to feel empowered. Just keep checking people out or see what feels right to you, or don't be afraid to leave if it doesn't feel quite right, or take what's good. And don't feel obliged to kind of parrot the rest or something like that. My friend Bob Thurman says if a teacher tells you they have absolutely the only way, first he said, run. And then he said, hold on to your wallet and then run.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm here. I started meditating with the Insight Timer app, so appreciate that. Thank you for that. I wanted to touch a little bit more on this kind of secularism and more so the consumerism and kind of self-help focus that I think has kind of come to characterize some of the meditation stuff in the US. And I'm just wondering, for me, I kind of started at that self-help spot and then it just really opened up. And so I'm wondering, your thoughts on what gets lost when we really kind of narrow the focus. The understanding suffering was not about your suffering, it was about the great suffering, the matter of life and death, and ultimately escaping the cycle of life and death. And so I feel like that can be off-putting to some people, and we don't want to be exclusive, but what are your thoughts about kind of how that could be lost, or if it is lost, and if that's a problem in the US?
Yeah. I'm not sure it's a problem because it's like I described myself, There was a kind of natural unfolding of what was motivating me that I couldn't have engineered, or it would have been quite hypocritical for me to imply that I was practicing in the beginning for the sake of all beings. I wasn't really, and I couldn't, nor could I. But once I didn't feel so alone in my pain, for example, or once I had a different perspective on what I was experiencing, then more compassion just automatically came. And so it was a kind of natural thing that changed. I think that there's a lot of unknown in what happens as we decontextualize these practices. Because even in a not religious or dogmatic way, they are embedded, in practices of generosity or speech, looking at how you speak to your neighbor or things like that, which we tend to discard and just have kind of the sort of mental training part of it. And so it's sort of an odd thing, too. And maybe okay, but maybe not. We'll find out. But I think it just evolves in some way for someone. And I know that people, because I go to all kinds of different places to teach, and people are people, is what I found. And that, nobody, say, in a corporation thus far has said to me, I'd really like to be, more soulless so I can be more productive, so I can put in more hours and get rich, because I heard mindfulness really can make you more successful. Everybody talks about their alcoholic brother or their teenage kid or their own inability to sleep or their, it's kind of like that. And if that's what we call self-help, I think it's a good place to start. It's only recognize our own distress that actually enables us to have compassion for somebody else anyway.
So this will have to be the final question.
Yeah, sorry, last question. Thank you so much for sharing the lotus which grew out of the mud of your suffering with us. I feel very fortunate to have heard your talk.
Thank you.
I have one logistic question. I was recording your talk because I teach a Buddhist philosophy class here. Would it be okay to use it?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And you partly already answered my question. My question was about bodhicitta. And for example, your teacher is very clearly a bodhisattva to me. And actually in the Tibetan language, as you probably know, we call bodhisattvas heroes of enlightenment. And you said you were not a warrior, but I think you are one, and your weapon is loving kindness. So I would disagree with that. But so I have a question, like, how would you recommend that we deal with this whole question of bodhicitta? And the practice of bodhicitta, and you partly answered it, but just like maybe a little more, if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
You mean in terms of motivation of practice for
Exactly.
the sake of others? Yeah.
Right, and then I mean we have this whole discussion going on between Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism and bodhicitta and the lack of bodhicitta and what else, and so I'm quite interested in that question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Uh-huh. Well, there are, I mean, if one is going to explore Buddhist teaching, there are a lot of historical schisms and, all kinds of things which I felt I did not personally have to be lost in. I have Tibetan teachers and I have had Burmese teachers, and I, think also I was kind of able to hear things differently at different times. And so in the beginning, the idea of bodhicitta, which is sort of a commitment to the welfare and happiness of others, even through one's practice or enlightenment, it was kind of abstract for me in the beginning, and I might have said it, but I didn't really mean it. And it was only much later, through kind of the evolution of my understanding, that it came to be a more genuine understanding or expression of what I cared about. But we all have certain kinds of conditioning, sometimes very, very strong conditioning. And for some people, even just imagining that possibility is incredibly enlivening and opening. And for other people, it's like being lectured in a way. It's very intimidating. I have one book I wrote with Bob Thurman. It's called Love Your Enemies. And I begged the publisher, I said, please don't call it that. Because my concern was that people would feel lectured at, like it's not that easy to love your enemies, and what does that mean anyway? And before that was the title, just one iteration before, because we went through 50 titles for that book. Bob had seen a movie or something. I think that was it. Bob had seen a movie, and there was a church in the movie, and the way churches, often have those neon signs with some statement. So the statement was, love your enemies, it will drive them crazy. And that was going to be the title of the book. And I liked that one, and I was actually in England, and there was a British branch of the publisher, and they had designed, covers for Love Your Enemies, It'll Drive Them Crazy. When I got the news that they were dropping It Will Drive Them Crazy, and I called America, I said, please don't do that. But they did it. But it was like that feeling, like, uh-oh, one more person telling me how I should be, and, what a perfected model would look like. And for some people, it just strikes them that way, and it's not that helpful.
So please join us in expressing our appreciation for our every 2-year visit.
Thank you.